As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So one thing was the Houthis' reaction to the U.S. launching this military operation, this new international coalition in the Red Sea. The Houthis said that they won't back down in defense of Gaza. So Yemen's Houthis responded to the U.S. launching a new military operation in the Red Sea by vowing that attacks on commercial shipping in the region will continue even if the U.S. mobilizes the entire world. The U.S. launched a 10-nation naval task force dubbed Operation Prosperity Garden after major shipping companies began pausing Red Sea transits due to the Houthi attacks. So it's 10 nations, including the U.S. Bahrain is the only regional country, and they're not on the Red Sea, but they're the only Arab country that has joined in on this coalition. So Mohammed al-Bukaiti, he is a senior member of the Houthis' political bureau. He said, quote, "Even if America succeeds in mobilizing the entire world, our military operations will not stop, no matter the sacrifices it costs us. America's announcement of the establishment of the Coalition of Shame will not prevent us from continuing our military operations until the crimes of genocide in Gaza are stopped and food, medicine, and fuel are allowed to enter its besieged population," end quote. So that's what they've been saying all along, is that the only way to get them to stop is for a ceasefire in Gaza. So the Houthis are vowing to target all commercial shipping going to and from Israeli ports. They've also fired missiles and drones at Israeli territory. In some cases, U.S. warships have intervened and intercepted Houthi attacks. And so definitely an area to really keep an eye on here. It does seem like things can really potentially explode. So this article is from Consortium News, from Joe Loria. And it says, imprisoned publisher Julian Assange will face 2 high court judges over 2 days on February 20th to the 21st in 2024. And this is going to happen in London in what will likely be his last appeal against being extradited to the United States to face charges of violating the Espionage Act. Assange's wife, Stella Assange, confirmed that the hearing will take place at the Royal Courts of Justice. Assange had an earlier request to appeal rejected by High Court Judge Jonathan Swift on June 6th. Assange then filed an application to appeal that decision, and the dates have now been set. Assange is seeking to challenge both the Home Secretary's decision to extradite him, as well as to cross-appeal the decision by the lower court judge, Vanessa Barrister. Barrister had ruled in January 2021 to release Assange from Belmarsh prison and deny the U.S. request for extradition based on Assange's mental health, the chances of him to commit suicide, and the conditions of U.S. prison. So the original ruling was that he should not be extradited, that he should be released. But then the U.S. appealed her decision, issuing diplomatic assurances that Assange would not be mistreated in prison. The High Court, after a 2-day hearing in March 2022, accepted those assurances and rejected Assange's appeal. So this does seem to be his last chance to avoid extradition to the U.S. for the crime of exposing U.S. war crimes. That's why they want to lock him up. Gaza death toll at 20,000, likely to be even higher. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone. He did some extra writing today. After 10 weeks of Israeli military operations in Gaza, authorities have counted 20,000 dead Palestinians. An overwhelming number of the dead are innocent civilians with no ties to Hamas. An aid group warns the actual death toll is likely higher as thousands of missing Gazans lay dead or dying under the rubble. Israeli officials say civilian deaths are part of eliminating Hamas. So there's a press release from the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs basically saying that the death toll is likely much higher because of all the people under the rubble. And according to Gaza's government media office, the dead includes 8,000 children and 6,200 women, and at least 50,000 people have been wounded in these strikes. And that's another big number. And considering how the health systems have collapsed, a lot of those people aren't getting proper treatment. There's a lot of people that are maimed, a lot of children that are going to be crippled for life because of this. Just really horrific stuff. So an Israeli official told reporters on Wednesday that the mass destruction of civilian targets in Gaza is part of Israel's strategy of defeating Hamas. Reuters reported a legal advisor to the Israeli Defense Forces said that the Israeli military was carrying out thousands and thousands of attacks, and often attacks that require heavy firepower to destroy tunnels under Gaza used by Hamas. And Kyle mentions that report from 972 magazine that basically said the civilian, they're purposely targeting civilians. It's part of their strategy. And that's how, so over 20,000 in just over 2 months of this, and no sign of things slowing down. This article is from Responsible Statecraft, and it says the EU Council Summit of December 14th to the 15th offered a significant, if perhaps mainly symbolic, gesture toward Ukraine in agreeing to the formal opening of accession negotiations. So that's about Ukraine's membership in the EU. But at the same meeting, the bloc failed to approve financial support for Ukraine for the 4-year period through 2027, amounting to 50 billion euros. Approval of this aid was vetoed by Hungary. So the EU has been working to get this 50 billion euro aid package to Ukraine for a while now. It seems like it's just been going on for a long time. And this is 50 billion euros over a 4-year period that Ukraine would receive, and they still haven't been able to get it through. And it's Hungary is the big one that's been blocking it. But I know now, I believe Slovakia is against not just the military aid, but also financial aid to Ukraine. So that could also be a problem, because with the U.S. Aid drying up, the EU was thought to maybe be able to fill some gaps, but they're still just not able to pass this.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
What if the acceptance of the government as God has ruined individual initiative, destroyed personal work ethic, fostered cancerous laziness, and enhanced deep poverty, and most of all you have here, and impelled thoughtlessness, obedience to the government in those who have accepted it?
So, the government is like the devil popping out from behind a tree. Hey, give me your freedom, and I'll keep you safe. Now, of course, we all know that is a bargain that never works out. You give up your freedom, and you also give up your safety. But the government, of course, goes even farther. Murray Rothbard used to have a great one-liner. You're sitting at home one night, relaxing, and there's a knock on the door. You open the door, and there's a guy with a gun. And you go, I'm going to call the police. And the guy goes, no, don't bother. We are the police. We're here to take your money so that we can give it away in your name. So that's what the government does. It takes from the haves and gives to the have-nots. And then the have-nots are so devoted to the government, it's as if the government is their God, because they rely on the government for their subsistence every month. And the politicians, of course, want to increase the size of the have-nots so as to increase their voting base, so as to assure that the politicians will stay in office.
And what you said about, giving it to the have-nots, yes, but they also give to the haves. And
yes, of course they do. Of course they do.
They give the haves, the biggest of the haves, the most.
Correct. The government bribes the states with cash, the rich with bailouts, the middle class with tax cuts, and the poor with wealth transfers. The government exists on bribery. And the bigger you are, billionaire, state of New York, state of California, the bigger your bribe is.
That's right. Look at this crap. Hey, I'm gonna build a building. Hey, I'm gonna create jobs. I want a tax cut. I'm gonna build this. I want a tax cut. I want you to give me money to do this. Oh yeah, sure. Oh, and by the way, here's a payback. Morons and imbeciles call it campaign contributions. Adults call it bribes and payoffs. You go on here, you say, what if freedom is our birthright, given to us by a true God, not by the government as God?
Well, the government acts as if freedom were a water faucet, and it can turn it on when it wants and turn it off when it wants. Even though everybody in the government has taken an oath to the Constitution, and even though the Ninth Amendment to the Constitution specifically provides for rights coming from our humanity too numerous to list in the document, every president believes that he can curtail rights by some sort of executive order. None of them take seriously the Constitution.
This is something, by the way, it's all over the world. You got these little clowns that become president, prime ministers, chancellors, and this is what I've decided, and this is what I'm going to do, and you do what I tell you to do. And again, it keeps going down. Look at the COVID war. Lock down your business. Stand 6 feet apart. Put on a mask. Do this, do that, do this, do that, do that, do this, do this. And yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Again, you have over here, what if we can never pursue happiness fully or know God completely without personal freedom?
We can't. We can never be happy. This is another thing that you've been out front on. Happiness is now a bad word in the government's articulation of it, even though the purpose of the Declaration of Independence is to secure, Jefferson now, the right to pursue happiness. But we can't pursue happiness without freedom. If the day the government tells you how to be happy is the day we're slaves.
You just said what you just said. You can't pursue happiness without freedom.
Correct. And the day the government tells you how to pursue happiness is the day we are slaves.
And that's what we're slaves.
Yes.
We've become, this is, one of my lines is that we the people are plantation workers of Slavelandia.
Yes.
And that's what it's become. And one of our top trends for 2024 is going to be World War III. It's going to become official. There's either going to be a major false flag event, or with Ukraine going down, they're not coming back. It's only going to get worse. And they're going to do a baby bomb, a Russian nuclear plant, something that's going to get them back to get support, a major false flag event. And Israel is going to ramp up this war, and they're going to bring Iran into it.
Yes.
And when that happens, it's going to be the official World War III. It's like, okay, all right, boys and girls, World War I began when they assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo. No, it didn't begin then. It began before that. Oh no, World War II began when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor.
The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, that they knew about.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Yeah, isn't it? Everything's criminalized. I think you quoted Neil Gorsuch early in your book saying something to...
Yes, I was so happy to find that quote from the Supreme Court justice, because some people think I'm radical. But no, so I have a quote from him. I even had a quote from favorite liberal justice, Peter Ginsburg, and folks like that. But now it's fascinating that people are recognizing that, the government has criminalized everything. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that's a good idea nowadays.
Right. That is rather the problem. But yeah, of course, well, Mr. Moderate Jim Bovard quoting Supreme Court justices. What is your problem with old Jim? All right. I'm more or less keeping this thing in order, although if there's disorder, it's not within the frame. We'll put it that way. Right. But again, talking about last rights here, this is, as with other books of yours that I've read, it covers so much in so many different areas that I want to cover just a little bit of a whole bunch of things. So, of course, there's a section in here on housing, because government has screwed that up, and I've written about that myself. But there's a particular...
there's a book you did on that was the best New York Times bestseller, right?
Thank you, Jim. Meltdown, which would be somewhere on the shelf behind there. That's right. Well, you have a section, though, about something called Section 8. And we all hear Section 8 over and over and over. But I don't think anybody knows exactly what's in Section 8, because no one's read it. So what does that actually mean, and what are some of the problems associated with it?
Section 8 is a federal rental subsidy program created in the late 1974. It expanded pretty quickly, and it's become a synonym for urban problems, or shifting the urban problems to the suburbs. There have been some studies that show a high correlation between Section 8 and a higher homicide rate. There are areas where what the government does is give out vouchers, and people can take these vouchers and then rent an apartment or house wherever they please, just as long as the price isn't too high. But the level for these Section 8 vouchers is a lot higher than what most Americans pay for rent. And you've had a lot of trouble in areas where they were linked to crime. The Housing and Urban Development Agency did a big study to see the impact of the Section 8 on the recipients. Didn't look at the effect on the neighbors, but one of the things that came out was there was a huge increase in crime by young people and the families of that. There was a study in Chicago that showed thousands of violent crimes at Section 8 addresses. The government tended to be very secretive as far as some of the real problems of the program, but it's come out, and there was even a rap band in D.C. for a while. They called itself Section 8 Law. It's kind of like you wonder how the program gets a rap.
I just realized, by the way, if I can back up a bit, I forgot to ask you something I wanted to ask about TSA. If somebody said, all right, Mr. Smart Guy Libertarian, I understand that the TSA has its problems, but, look, there are bad actors in the world, and I don't want them flying on planes. So if you're so smart, what do you recommend?
Privatizing airport security, like they do in Canada, like they do in most Western European nations. There's no reason that the person who scans you needs to be a federal agent, because there's a huge issue that federal agents tend to have sovereign immunity. And so it doesn't matter if they grab you or, it's when I was doing some stories on TSA right around the time of Kavanaugh, his Supreme Court nomination, and there were the allegations of him sexually abusing a young woman, a young girl. And so what I did is did some searches on Twitter on TSA, just searching TSA and the names of various female anatomy. And there was this tidal wave of complaints from women who felt like they had been molested by TSA at checkpoints. But there was no legal recourse, because the Justice Department and TSA were claiming that the TSA agents had immunity. That is starting to crumble. There have been 2 federal appeals courts that have basically turned that down. And now the TSA is actually going to have to justify its groping. And that could go badly.
It's a it is such an interesting microcosm of so much of what the state does that on the surface of it, if you don't look beneath the state's own rationale for it, then you'd be satisfied that this is simply, public-minded people just trying to do what's best for everybody. I mean, that it's over and over again. Whatever it is they're doing. Well, I mean, even the Fed managing the money supply, that's also in the interest of you and me, Jim. And you get just one little layer beneath it, and you see, and then once you see that, as you can never unsee it.
I hope you're right. I mean, the Federal Reserve is a great example. I mean, back when people were voting in the 2020 presidential election, when they were mailing in their ballots, I don't recall people asking for an 18% fall in the value of the dollar since Biden got elected, since Biden took office. But that's what's happened. And the media's tried to sweep it under the rug. This is having a huge impact on tens of millions of Americans, and especially to us independent contractors.
The Peter Schiff Show. Think about all the online commerce. Everything that you buy on Amazon, on Walmart, all that stuff is shipped. And FedEx had a pretty big miss. They missed on the top line. They missed on the bottom line. And in fact, year over year, there was a decline, an actual decline in their revenues. Now, I'm sure that over the last year, FedEx has raised its prices. I mean, everybody's raised their prices. But despite that, they're actually doing less in nominal sales than they did before. And so this should, throw cold water on this parade that the economy is in great shape. Because the fact that a lot less stuff is getting shipped is an indication that maybe the consumer is running out of gas. I was listening to a clip, just came up. For some reason, this thing came up for me on YouTube, but it was a Dave Ramsey clip. But this woman had called, or a guy had called up and, talking about all the problems that they were having financially. Even though they had a joint income of about $360,000 a year, they were still living paycheck to paycheck. And the wife had about $250,000 of student debt. But he pointed out that during this recent moratorium on student loans, when they didn't have to pay their student loans, they used that money to, build like a barn or something on their property. They spent like $100,000 building a barn or something, but they only did that because they used the money that they otherwise would have spent on repaying their student loans. And I'm sure this has been a typical situation where all the Americans that didn't have to pay their student loans, they just used that money. They've been spending that money on other things. Well, to the extent that they're now making payments on these student loans, well, they have to stop spending money on other things. And so maybe that's why FedEx is not shipping as much stuff, is because the people are now paying their student loans back instead of buying stuff on Amazon that needs to be shipped. Ever since Powell let the cat out of the bag and basically conceded that rates are coming down, and they're coming down substantially, the markets, got ahead of it. And in fact, I think the mood on Wall Street was, happy days are here again. We're going back to zero. We're going back to QE, because that is the experience of the past. I mean, once the Fed starts cutting, they don't stop until they get to zero. I mean, that's what they've done in the past, right? And so why would anybody assume that the future is going to be any different? And in fact, considering how quickly Powell capitulated on rate cuts, because as I pointed out in an earlier podcast, in the November meeting, Powell said, we're not even thinking about rate cuts. And then in the December meeting, not only are they thinking about it, but they're plotting it on these dot plots. And that's all he talked about is cutting rates. So in one meeting, it was a complete pivot on rate cuts. Why shouldn't the markets expect that a similar pivot is coming with respect to quantitative easing? I mean, that's, the big enchilada that's coming is a return to QE. And why wouldn't they do that? They returned to QE before. Remember, when the Fed's balance sheet was like $4 trillion, they started shrinking it. They never even made it down to $3 trillion, and then they blew it up to $9 trillion. And so, so now they started to shrink it. All right, it's below $8 trillion. But if they couldn't shrink the smaller balance sheet, it's even less likely that they can shrink this even larger balance sheet, especially in an election year. The odds would seem to favor that going into an election year, especially, when Biden is as unpopular as he is, right? So he's going to need a lot of help to get reelected. And the Fed typically can be counted on to supply that help. And so the markets are getting in front of this. Obviously, it's an election year. They want to put a lipstick on the pig of an economy, that is Bidenomics. What can the Fed do? Well, let's start cutting rates. Let's go back to quantitative easing. Let's goose the markets. Let's get people excited and let them believe that the economy is getting better. And maybe they think, who cares about these inflation numbers because we just got to make it through the election. Maybe the result of us returning to quantitative easing and cutting rates, maybe the impact that has on prices won't manifest itself until after the November elections, and then it's too late, right? You can't take your vote back, right? If you actually get fooled into believing we have a good economy and you vote, 4 more years for Biden, and then after the election, you find out the truth, right? All of a sudden, prices take off and it hits the fan. You can't get your vote back. I mean, it's a final buy, right? There's no returns, right? You vote and you're stuck with who you voted for. So all they have to do is delay the consequences until after this election. So the markets know this, they think this, and so they're buying. But then, you've got all these Fed guys coming out and saying, maybe we're not going to cut. We're not so sure, right? We got to wait and see. We actually need more data. We're not really talking about rate cuts. And since that's the only thing that the market's got going for it, it's all about liquidity. It's all about inflation. That's the story. It's an expensive market, and the economy is weak. But that's the hope that the markets have been bid up on. And so I think finally we've started to see some surrender. So.
Well, but Jim, what about the federal court cases where they ruled that Snowden was right and that the stuff that he exposed was illegal, and then they struck it down and they forced Congress to pass these laws to fix it all, like in the deal?
Scott, it's important for you to cut back on the weed. Yeah, I mean, there were some judges that had some very eloquent decisions spurred by Snowden's revelation. Snowden is a hero, as I said in USA Today 5 years ago. Snowden should get the Presidential Medal of Freedom for what he did. But basically, Congress didn't do much at all, and they were kind of said, yeah, well, this is not so good. Now, it's funny, if you turn back the clock to the last time that FISA was reauthorized, early 2018, there was about 67 or maybe 84 minutes in which it was unclear if Congress would actually do that, because President Trump saw an episode or some comments on Fox News that said, oh, this is a terrible law. So Trump did a tweet or two saying, oh, this FISA stuff is terrible. We don't need this. But, there was a full court press on him, and Trump flipped within less than 2 hours. And so, of course, it got renewed.
Let me ask you about this article, more nails in the coffin of Biden's censorship regime. Dare I read that headline as somebody wrote it?
Hey, I didn't say it was my headline. So, yeah, I was. Well, see, this is the holiday season. So I'm trying to have much more upbeat headlines for the stories about how the government's blowing your rights to pieces.
Yeah, man. There you go. Well, I appreciate the half full take here. And you do have a great picture of Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger here featured testifying before Congress. And we got these lawsuits, and we got these great Twitter file journalists working on this. And we're learning more all the time. And the courts are angry about it, and the Congress is fighting about it. So tell us what's up.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of good pressure. It's one of the really good things about the GOP take over the House of Representatives. They've done some excellent hearings on the weaponization of government power. They haven't gotten the credit for it from the mainstream media because most of the media coverage has been in the tank for the feds. But they've been pushing it out. They're putting out layer after layer of detail of how the craven details of how the feds and federal contractors suppressed censored American speech. It's great that there was a federal district court that said that, the federal appeals court said that, and now it's before the Supreme Court. And one of the things which is interesting here is how the feds are seeking to define consent, because part of the defense for the saying that the FBI didn't censor is that, well, the FBI made a request and people consented. Yeah, you get the FBI, saying, this is a problem, take action on this. At the same time, you've got President Biden, who came out and accused social media companies of murder for not suppressing any information that might make people hesitate to get their COVID vaccines, which Biden also pulled strings to force the FDA to give full approval to, even though the evidence warned of a lot of problems with those vaccines.
Well, look, I mean, as always, it's not just an argument from authority. If what they're saying is really sharp and good and quotable and useful, that, hey, even the Supreme Court justice is saying that this is not right, even if he doesn't win every time. It's a powerful dissent for showing people what's right and just how far they've gone. God help us if people really start to feel after it's already been a decade of this and after another decade that, like, of course, this is just how it is. Government has to curate the news for us. Otherwise, we'd get it wrong. And if people really believe that that's just how it always is, well, geez, Scott, who's going to build the roads? Somebody's got to censor the channels,
Yeah, I mean, there's things are bad already. There was one recent poll that showed that 55% of American adults said that government should, protect people from false information. And I guess that would mean canceling all the elections. It's like, this is bizarre. And this is a time when only 20% of the people trust the government. So what you have is that people cannot politically add 2 and 2. Government's untrustworthy, but they're going to save us from false information.
Right.
Where did I go wrong?
I know. You know what? I remember 25 years ago, my friend Rick told me, well, at least they know they're being lied to, right? You can see that they know something's not right, but they just don't know who else to turn to other than whatever, the guys who supposedly are our protectors. They must be honest, or why would we have given them that job?
Well, thank God they've got podcasts now they can turn to.
Yeah. Well, the New York Times says they're unfettered, like shackles.
Unfettered.
Yeah, we gotta.
Hey, that's a badge of honor.
Seriously, and it's a reason for us to really watch out. I mean, this is sort of the final frontier of free speech, and they just took a massive subsidy away from SpaceX and their internet project, $900 million, I think it was, and so obviously didn't deserve that money at all in the first place. But you can see the government agenda there for Elon Musk's businesses, which are so government dependent. That they're trying to punish him.
It's
Keep him in line.
Hard times coming.
Yep.
Don't tread on us.
What is free market capitalism?
It's actually nothing more abstract and strange than the economic aspect of individual freedom. When people are free to go about their business and choose how to act, how to behave, whom to associate with, and what to do with their lives, that's freedom. And when we do this in the economic sphere, mostly associated with what kind of occupation we choose, whether we want to start businesses or not, how to save our money, whom to trade with and do business with. That's economic freedom. That's capitalism.
There seems to be a huge dichotomy. Almost everyone I speak to will say, oh yeah, sure, religious freedom is fine. You can have whatever religion you want, even if it's to your own detriment, even if you waste your entire life believing something that's false, so long as you don't force others to either fund your religion or join it. You can always persuade people. However, they have almost the complete opposite position when it comes to economic freedom. Yet, when you were doing research for this book, do you see why this dichotomy exists in the minds of so many people?
Well, yeah, I noticed that in so many places as well. People, theoretically, they like freedom and they like it in different spheres, but somehow it gets complicated the moment we start to talk about exchange, whenever we talk about money or something like that. And the impression I get when I talk to people is that they think about religious freedom and other kinds of personal liberties like that as something it's all about yourself. It's how you choose to live your own life. It doesn't really affect others, though it does, but less so than acting in the economic sphere. And that's true. The actions we do on a market, they always involve somebody else because we do business, we trade, we exchange. Somebody else is involved. And to me, that's the best part of it, because in a free market, then no deal ever happens unless both parties think that they both benefit from it. Otherwise, they would walk away. So whenever you affect others, it is by offering something that they wouldn't have otherwise. It might be your time, it might be goods, services, technological capacities, or funding, or what have you. Whatever it is, it's an offer to improve somebody else's life or not. So I think this is why it gets complicated. But to me, this is an extra argument for economic freedom.
I love the way you describe that, because so often the free market is seen as every man for himself, dog-eat-dog competition. Like, this completely complex network of millions of people exchanging is described as every man for himself, Robinson Crusoe style, which is so bizarre, the fact that ever took hold. I want to look at the Communist Manifesto. Tell me what is wrong, if anything, with this. Capitalism's immoral because people have to work to live. Communism's moral because it gives people what they need to live, regardless of whether they are forced to work. How do you respond?
Well, the question is, if you don't have to work for your wealth, where does it come from? Capital doesn't just exist out there. It's something you create. Capital is capital goods. It's machinery. It's funds that you use to invest and build something new. It doesn't come from out of the blue. It's something that we all create. And if you say that someone is going to be able to live without working, that it's somehow degrading to do something for others in order to earn an income or capital, then it means that somebody else is going to have to work for you. So it really means a system of enforced labor. And that's really what the ideas of Marx and Engels led to when they said that we'll find another, less degrading way of creating wealth than having to find the places in the economy where we do the best good services to others and exchange with others voluntarily. Well, then they ended up with forcing people to move to certain areas of the economy to do certain services for the government instead.
When it comes to mass production of goods that increases the standard of living of the average person, we frequently hear that, well, when things are privatized, only the rich can afford them. What is it about capitalism that allows products and services over time to both increase in quality and increase in their accessibility to the average person? I'm thinking of cameras by people like George Eastman did not invent the camera, but he made it much more available. Henry Ford did not invent the car, but he made it much more accessible to people. Same thing with Vanderbilt and the steamships. Is this a feature of capitalism, or could the state take this over and do just as good a job in healthcare and housing?
Well, I think we can look at the empirical data. What is it that comes down in price? Well, everything that's traded on a market. And what is that that has over the long period of time, over a longer period of time? What is it that stays costly or increases in price? Well, everything that the government is involved with, basically, and this is because of the basic incentive of capitalism. The elite is small. That's why it's called the elite. And if you only produce for them, you won't make much money. The low and middle income households, there are many more of them. And if you can continue to turn what used to be luxury goods for the elites into routine manufacturing for the poor, then you will make tons of profits as well. It was Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, who said that, Queen Elizabeth in the 17th and late 16th century, she had silk stockings and she could afford cotton clothes. And that's not what's new with capitalism. The new thing with capitalism is that you come up with methods and better production and new ideas to make sure that even factory girls could have stockings as well, and many pairs of them as well, because that's how you make a fortune in the long run. But that's all dependent on this competition from lots of different entrants into the market who continue to come up with even weirder ideas on how to make things come down in price over time.
This is Dan Patrick. He's the lieutenant governor here in Texas, and he suggests maybe we should take Biden off the ballot in Texas. Maybe that's a good idea. And if you go to the next one, here's what Dan Patrick says. Seeing what happened in Colorado tonight makes me think, except we believe in democracy in Texas, but maybe we should take Joe Biden off the ballot for allowing 8 million people to cross the border since he's been president, disrupting our state far more than anything anyone else has done in recent history.
Yeah, and there are Democrats waking up to this, the ones who want to live in a reasonable society and not look like a jerk for supporting something that is so outlandish. So they're starting to come around, and with the right ruling, there's going to be a lot of people, this issue gets dropped and people will have less fun about it, but it's still very, very serious, and they're undermining the total principles. But the system isn't all that great anyway. The electoral system, the majority dictatorship of what we have, the founders didn't like it. And from the very first campaign I was ever in, I was introduced to how it really operates, because there was a shock that I was beating this Democrat and all kinds of things were done. So that's a long time ago. And we know about LBJ. LBJ could never have been president with us really stealing an election, which is fully documented. So it's there's a lot of shortcomings on democracy. And because they always use the election of an individual, but the founders didn't set it that way. They wanted a representative government. The election of the president was never well intended to say that, and people want to move further in the direction of saying it's a majority vote. It's just individual vote. So we want the cities that really need a lot of help. San Francisco and Chicago and Detroit, Washington D.C. They can elect the president and cancel out 98% of the other population. So that's what democracy can end up. And it also shows that if they're going to do it to one group, the other people came along. So I think that I think Patrick knows that's not going to happen. But I think it's a great way of making a point, because some of the Democrats now are saying, if we keep impeaching Trump. Maybe they'll do that to our president. And what do we have? We have an impeachment process going on.
Yeah.
Of course, this guy deserves it.
Yes. Yeah, they're certainly there. I mean, it does feel like a descent into idiocracy in a way because, oh yeah, you bar our guy, well, we're going to bar your guys. And pretty soon, I mean, it's a joke. And I just have a couple more examples of Republicans suggesting we could do tit for tat. Let's go through a couple of these if we can. This is from The Blaze. This is Ron DeSantis. He reacts to the Colorado Supreme Court power grab quote. There was no trial. We got a thing popping up on that corner. There was no trial on any of this. Could we just say that Biden can't be on the ballot because he let in 8 million illegals? So here's DeSantis in Florida. And here we have the next one. If we go next, this is Kellyanne Conway on her show. She asked if Governor Kristi Noem, if she could bar Biden from the South Dakota ballot. Why can't she do it? And here is another interesting one if we can. And I don't know who this person is. He could be a kook, but it makes an interesting point. Phil Kezak, he says, so under Colorado reasoning, a Florida court could hold a hearing, determine that Joe Biden took bribes, and bar him from being on the ballot for a federal election, despite the fact that Joe Biden was never formally charged and convicted of bribery. Interesting.
But if it did happen, I think that would tip things over. I think there would be a lot of violence, and in that sense, very, very dangerous. And a lot of the restraints, you can't believe it, but there's probably been restraints of people who get so disgusted with what's happening and how destructive it is to endorse a system that preaches and teaches, the redistribution of wealth as a holy thing. And of course, that's the entire system we've had for almost 100 years. And it's amazing we get by that way. And then they turn around and believe in lying is okay. That's not a big deal. And having counterfeit money, that's okay too. And they, on the vote count, it always bothers me when they say they want to overthrow the election or overthrow the government. Yeah. Well, I don't know why they couldn't have referred to this as a recount. Yeah. Why don't we count all the votes? Yeah. Find out if they were legal votes. We just want an investigation. If you have nothing to hide, you should be all for this. Yeah. To clean the air. Oh no, we'll put you guys in jail for suggesting it. Yeah.
I mean, Trump gets himself in trouble by the way he says something, but it's not illegal to put your foot in your mouth constantly. That's unfortunately just his style. But if an insurrection is using deception to change the electoral results, then you could certainly make the argument, and I think you have, that the Russiagate was a kind of insurrection because it was a bunch of lies, it was deception, and the intent of that was to change the outcome of the election. So maybe the other side is just as guilty if that's all it takes.
Yeah, and they use January 6th as the insurrection that Trump did. But I think the policing activity, the FBI and the Justice Department, that is where you could probably make a pretty good case that there's been an insurrection and a destruction of our judicial system. That's much more dangerous to us than what they're claiming Trump did.